It's well known that the European conquest of the New World that began with Christopher Columbus's voyages devastated native populations throughout the Americas. The causal factors were numerous, but most devastating were the diseases that European and African colonists and slaves brought with them, consequences of populations that had been separated for over 10,000 years being reconnected. In fact, the devastation was so great in the first century of conquest that it literally caused the planet's temperatures to drop. You see, the loss of roughly 90% of the population, an estimated 56 million people, meant that forests and jungles reclaimed farmland and cities, thus soaking up vast amounts of carbon dioxide. Scientists at the University of London found that global temperatures dropped, triggering a mini ice age in which the River Thames in London regularly froze over, snowstorms hit Portugal, and European agriculture was severely disrupted, resulting in the famine, warfare, and political instability that characterized the late 16th and 17th centuries of Europe. Hello, I'm Troy Bickham, and I'm a professor in the Department of History at Texas A&M University, where I teach and write books on the histories of Britain and its empire, North America and the US, and food during the 16th through the 19th centuries. Today, I would like to discuss the Columbian Exchange. This is a huge topic explored by many scholars about which many books and articles have been written. Far too much material to cover completely in today's lecture. In consequence, a short bibliography will be made available, and I encourage you to make use of this if you'd like to learn more about this critical topic in American and world history. So my examination today will be more an exploration of some of the key components rather than an exhaustive examination. I'll tackle the subject in three parts. First, what was the Columbian Exchange and why study it? Second, how did it impact the Americas? And third, how did it impact the rest of the world? So on to part one. The term itself is relatively new, coined by Alfred Crosby Jr., a professor of history and geography about 50 years ago. He used it to describe the biological exchange of plants, animals, and diseases between Europe and Africa and the Americas that took place in the aftermath of Christopher Columbus's voyages. Crosby primarily focused on the biological exchange and how it affected the Americas, but since then, scholars have explored how the exchange shaped the societies and environments of Africa, Asia, and Europe, as well as the Americas. The Columbian Exchange is a great reminder that history is full of unintended consequences, and that we are very much shaped by our environments. As much as we might proclaim ourselves as masters of the world and our destinies, we are very much living organisms whose existences are intertwined with those organisms that surround us. Technological advances have provided air conditioning to shield us from hot weather and transportation to ensure that water and food are available even when we are stricken with drought. But we are all still very much part of an ecosystem. And sometimes we can shape it, but other times we can't. History gives us lessons of how far human societies might push the envelope and the devastating consequences when we go too far. While the Columbian Exchange is the most studied example of how rapid environmental changes, human-caused or natural, shaped human history, there are plenty of other examples. The European colonization of Australia and New Zealand, the deforestation of Easter Island by its native peoples, and the introduction of the brown snake by U.S. troops in World War II in the South Pacific. These are all examples, great and small, of the impact of human movement on ecosystems. Another example is the massive eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia in 1815, which spread enough ash in the atmosphere to dim the sun and plunge the northern hemisphere into a year-long winter, referred to at the time as the year without summer. Crops failed as snows devastated farms in June, causing widespread famine and misery. It also caused Mary Shelley, who was stuck that summer in a freezing house in Switzerland, to write Frankenstein's Monster, which warns against the hubris of scientists who think that they can be gods over their environments. And of course, the lessons and warnings of the Columbian Exchange have implications as we face the consequences of climate change within our own lifetimes. Now on to part 2, the impact on the Americas. When Montezuma began his reign over the Aztec Empire, he could not possibly have imagined that within 2 decades, the supposedly permanent and invulnerable empire would collapse under the weight of disease, invasion, and famine brought about by the Columbian Exchange. Within a couple of generations, the vast network of roads and farms that had fed the empire's roughly 6 million inhabitants were largely derelict and deforested. His capital, the largest city in the Americas, and far larger than any city in Spain, or Europe for that matter, with the singular exception of Paris, was destroyed and rebuilt as Mexico City, whose population would not reach its pre-conquest height for over 300 years. The historian and geographer Alfred Crosby used his idea of the Columbian Exchange to explain why Europeans were able to conquer the Americas so quickly. As of July 2022, just over 1 million people in the U.S. had died from COVID-19, according to the government's figures. That's roughly 0.3%. Think of the social and economic disruption that has caused. Now imagine if that 0.3% was over 300 times that, or 90%, which is what happened to the peoples living in the Americas. It's pretty tough to organize resistance or maintain a society if society is in chaos and governments are already collapsing. And that was part of Alfred Crosby's point. Until then, scholars had largely focused on the idea of the supposed backwardness and inferiority of the indigenous people in the face of the technologically and supposedly morally superior Europeans. Now, guns and horses did provide some advantages, but diseases like smallpox killed off far more indigenous people, irrespective of the grand claims of the Spanish, the French, the Portuguese, or English at the time. Critically, there were multiple diseases and multiple disease vectors. Europeans' presence throughout the Americas devastated populations, many of which they did not intend to conquer or even interact directly, as waves of disease spread from one native community to another. In fact, the Pilgrims who arrived on the Mayflower and settled Plymouth Colony in 1620 built their community literally on top of the abandoned Patuxent village, whose inhabitants had been almost entirely wiped out just a few years earlier by a disease they likely caught from French fur traders. In fact, just a few years earlier, Captain John Smith had mapped the area, noting its cleared fertile fields for farming, neat houses, and vigorous inhabitants. The annihilation of so much of the native peoples of northeastern America played a critical role in allowing the English to establish New England colonies. There was plenty of land available with only limited competition, at least until native populations began to recover over a generation later. Now, of course, the Columbian Exchange wasn't just about the introduction of diseases, and importantly, it had other consequences that have reverberated throughout history. Before Columbus's second voyage, domesticated animals were in short supply in the Americas, and the Europeans quickly introduced horses, cattle, pigs, and chickens for food and, critically, transportation. Until then, the largest domesticated animal could be found in the Andes with the llamas and alpacas, but no domesticated animal in the Americas until that time was over 100 pounds, which meant that carts were effectively non-existent and that the fastest way to get around was on foot. Domesticated animals also fundamentally changed landscapes. For starters, domesticated animals eat a lot more than people. Cattle need fields of grass rather than forests, and they need roughly 10 pounds of feed to produce 1 pound of meat. In fact, an estimated 90% of the land in the U.S. today that is used to grow plant-based food is doing so to feed livestock rather than people directly. Water is even more demanding. Competition for land in eastern North America regularly led to violence. Native peoples wanted to retain much of the woodlands for hunting the animals that were essential to their economies and cultures. Europeans wanted to clear the forest for fields for crops and livestock. Most colonies and later U.S. states on the eastern seaboard, for example, actively encouraged the eradication of animals that preyed on livestock and pushed many once abundant species such as wolves to extinction. Or, in the case of the iconic bald eagle, which found farmers' chickens to be tasty and easy prey, also to the brink of extinction. New plants also poured into the Americas. Various grains, particularly wheat, along with grapes and olives, quickly arrived to feed Europeans and their livestock. Perhaps the most historically momentous plants to arrive was sugarcane. Sugarcane was amongst the first plants to be domesticated in human history, evolving in what is now Papua New Guinea, about 10,000 years ago. By the time of Columbus, sugarcane had spread through much of Asia into parts of Africa and Europe. It was cultivated in the Mediterranean and heavily prized, and also incredibly expensive in Europe. Sugar requires a tropical or subtropical environment to thrive, and the European colonists soon realized that the Caribbean islands and the adjacent mainland provided near-perfect conditions. The targeted area's native ecosystems, including the people, plants, and animals, were effectively eradicated and replaced with sugarcane. The juices of sugarcane were refined through boiling into syrups and granulated sugar, and then sometimes distilled into rum. Now that's why the pirates in the Caribbean are so associated with rum, and some brands even still carry pirate imagery and names today. Sugar, once the preserve in Europe of the wealthy, became one of the most ubiquitous goods in the Atlantic world. In Britain, for example, per capita sugar consumption grew from a few ounces in 1700 to 20 pounds per person by 1800, and thus the profession of dentistry was born. Until then, if you wanted a tooth out, which was relatively rare, you went to your barber. Sugar transformed European economies. In Britain, sugar consumption fueled what historians have dubbed the consumer revolution, the idea that people worked harder and longer hours to make more money to buy more stuff, and the economy responded by making more goods available. In 1700, there were only a handful of grocery shops because most people met their needs by growing what they needed or buying it at local markets that largely sold local goods. Sugar was a foreign product in Britain, and so it was sold in grocery shops for the most part. And by 1800, there were 30,000 such shops selling sugar. This was the beginning of widespread shopping. After all, savvy shopkeepers that lured people with sugar would hope to sell an array of goods to customers while they were in the shop. Right? It's the very reason why if you go into a grocery store today, milk is almost inevitably in the back corner, so you can walk through the entire shop to buy other stuff along the way. And governments cared about this. In fact, the tax revenue on sugar alone in Britain by 1760 was enough to pay for the operating costs of the entire Navy in peacetime. Not surprisingly, governments invested such revenues in larger fleets and armies, both to extend and protect markets, as well as diversify the array of goods they could cultivate and sell around the world. Modern European empires that would come to control the vast majority of the world's population and resources by the mid-19th century were based primarily on that premise. Seen here is a map of the British Empire at its peak, which claimed dominion over 1/4 of the world's landmass and population. Equally significant was the labor required to produce sugarcane in the Americas. The diseases of the Columbian Exchange had largely wiped out, at least for a time, native labor forces, particularly in the islands and nearby mainland areas where sugar could grow and prosper. Harsh conditions, sugarcane is an incredibly labor-intensive crop, deterred many Europeans from settling the areas in sufficient and sustainable numbers for large-scale production of this incredibly profitable crop. So the Europeans turned to Africa. And between 1525 in 1866, roughly 12.5 million Africans were enslaved and transported to the Americas. The vast majority, about 80%, ended up in the Caribbean and what's now Brazil, where most were involved in the production of sugar and, to a lesser extent, coffee, which was another old world product that was transported to the Americas to be grown for European consumers. The demand for labor was so great that in almost any given year in the 17th and 18th centuries, the majority of people coming to the Americas as a whole were enslaved Africans. And even today, Brazil is the world's largest producer of both sugar and coffee, and just over half of its population identifies as being at least partly of African descent. And sugar and coffee are not the only non-native products, shaping economies in the Americas. The Americas are home to nations that are 3 of the top 5 producers of beef, 2 of the top 5 producers of wheat, 2 of the top 5 producers of chicken, and it's not just about money. Take a moment to think about how cattle production has shaped the culture of Texas. The same is true of such relationships as sugar in Cuba, coffee in Colombia, and bananas, another Asian transplant, in Ecuador. Thus, the exchange shaped many of the cultures, economies, and nations that exist in the Americas today. Now on to part 2, the impact on the world. I'd now like to explore the third part of our exploration of the Columbian Exchange, its impact on the outside world of the Americas. We've already touched on many of these topics already: the consumer revolution in Britain, the spread of economic-based European imperialism, the enslavement of Africans, and the transformation of the Americas into the production centers of non-native products such as sugar, coffee, and beef for the world's consumers. Without the Americas, an affordable hamburger with its beef center and wheaten bun would be near impossible in Europe. But now I'd like to turn to the favorite condiment for hamburgers: ketchup. You see, tomatoes, the heart and soul of ketchup, are the fruit of a plant that is indigenous to the Americas, particularly South America, Central America, and what's now Mexico, where the indigenous people domesticated it and incorporated it into their diets long before the arrival of Columbus. The Aztec word for the fruit being tomato. During the 16th century, it was quickly introduced to Europe, where it thrived and was later cultivated into a variety of types, most notably in Spain and Italy, where it became integral to the cuisine. In fact, even a cursory look at a grocery store shelves today highlights how much the tomato is synonymous with Italy. Of the world's top 5 producers of tomatoes, only one, the US, is in the Americas. The largest, China, is where the story of ketchup's origins take place. Originally, ketchup meant all sorts of sauces and condiments, with texts from China recording recipes more than 2,000 years ago. European merchants in the 18th century who were in China trading for tea took the sauces and brought them to England, where they were modified with local ingredients. In fact, if you were to ask for ketchup at the time of the American Revolution in London, most likely you would get a mushroom-based sauce. The first recorded recipe calling for tomatoes came from Philadelphia in 1812, but the modern recipe that uses vinegar, initially as a preservative, appeared in 1876 with the introduction of Heinz ketchup, the most widely consumed brand today. Tomatoes are not the only product to come from the Americas as a result of the Columbian Exchange. The fruit of the cocoa tree, the basis for chocolate, is another key example. A plant domesticated in Central America about 3,500 years ago, it was widely consumed by peoples in Central and South America. Celebrated by the Aztec as a gift from the gods and even used as currency, the beans were grown and consumed as a hot or cold beverage, usually flavored with a variety of spices, but mostly chilies. Europeans added sugar during the 19th century and popularized it into the form of the semi-solid sweetened chocolate that we know as chocolate candies and chocolate bars today. Today, 4 of the 5 largest producers of cocoa are actually countries in Africa, not Europe or the Americas. For the African country of the Ivory Coast, which is the largest producer of cocoa in the world, it accounts for 40% of that nation's export revenues. To tomatoes and chocolate, we can add the equally ubiquitous potato, which was first domesticated in the Andes in modern Peru at least 5,000 years ago, where it spread as a staple food source. Although just a few varieties account for the vast majority of commercially produced potatoes today, the potato was originally, and still in the Andes, a diverse plant producing a wide variety of shapes and sizes of edible tubers. In Africa and the Caribbean, varieties that became known as yams or sweet potatoes were developed and became central to local cuisines. This image is of an Ashanti yam ceremony or festival in what is now Ghana in 1817. Easy to cultivate, white varieties of the potato were adopted by Europeans as crops for the laboring poor. Peasants' cuisine throughout Europe, from Russia to Scotland, is packed with potatoes, which act as fillers to bulk up dishes. In particularly poor countries such as Ireland, it became synonymous with a hardscrabble rural landscape. In fact, the Irish became so dependent on a single variety of potato that a fungus, shown here, wiped out crops, causing terrible famines in the mid-19th century. 1 in 3 Irish either died or immigrated, and the population still has not fully recovered today. It is the reason why so many people in the U.S. and throughout the world claim Irish ancestry, why St. Patrick's Day, Ireland's patron saint, is so widely celebrated with Irish themes, and while Irish-themed bars can be found in cities around the world. Today, 2 of the top 2 producers of potatoes are actually Asian countries, China and India, where potatoes have become staples as well as export crops. The U.S. ranked 5th globally, and it's the only country in the Americas still in the top 10 of producers. Capsicum peppers, which include bell peppers, jalapenos, Tabasco, and cayenne, are another plant from the Americas that has gone global. First cultivated in Central and South America about 6,000 years ago, chilies were widely consumed in the region as a spice and food source upon Columbus's arrival. The Portuguese, who colonized Brazil in the 16th century, introduced them to South Asia, a place they were also colonizing at the time. There they spread and fundamentally transformed Asian cuisine. Today it's hard to imagine Indian and Chinese dishes without chilies. No hot curries or kung pao chicken. To this we can add Korean kimchi and also all the various European dishes that use paprika. Although a drug rather than a food, the American plant of tobacco deserves some mention. Globally, 7 of the largest producers of tobacco today are Asian or African. And while smoking has declined notably in the last 30 years in the U.S., it continues to thrive globally. In China, which is the largest consumer of tobacco in the world, there's some 300 million smokers, roughly 27% of adults, according to the World Health Organization. Probably first cultivated and purposely cultivated in Mexico about 7,000 years ago, tobacco grows wild throughout the Americas and was likely gathered and consumed long before then. By the time the first English colonists had arrived in Virginia in 1607, tobacco was widely cultivated throughout eastern North America and reasonably well-known luxury in Europe. When the colonists quickly realized there was not much gold that they could pillage from native peoples, they soon turned to grow tobacco for English and European markets. John Rolfe, husband of the now Disney-famous Pocahontas, is credited with the identifying and cultivation of a variety of tobacco that was robust and sufficiently fast-growing for export. Within a couple of decades, tobacco became the basis of Virginia colony's economy, culture, and in fact existence. Without tobacco to export, Virginia could not have survived, let alone prosper. Virginia tobacco became pervasive throughout Europe in the later 17th and 18th centuries. Glasgow and Scotland became the hub of the global trade, importing American tobacco and re-exporting it to the rest of Europe, transforming the town into the largest and most important city in the British Empire, second only to London. Within a century, tobacco had become infused into the daily routines of wealthy and poor Europeans alike, and a critical part of the British imperial economy. Like sugarcane, tobacco is a labor-intensive crop that thrives in particular climates and conditions. English colonists initially grew the tobacco primarily for themselves, supplementing their labor force with Native American slaves, some African slaves, and English criminals who had been sent to Virginia as punishment. Global demand and a desire for greater profits resulted in massive acceleration of tobacco production in the second half of the 17th century, and Virginia colonists shifted decidedly towards African slavery. In 1650, there were only about 500 enslaved people in Virginia, but 50 years later, by 1700, 1/3 of the population was enslaved Africans. Its great plantation producers of tobacco became the American colonial elite that would ultimately found the U.S. Families like the Washingtons, Jeffersons, the Lees, Monroes, and Madisons. I'd like to conclude with an attempt at answering the so what question. In other words, why does the Columbian Exchange matter? Well, it goes a long way in explaining several key aspects of history and our world. As already discussed, it explains why Europeans were able to colonize the Americas so quickly and completely. It also partly explains why so many Africans were enslaved and brought to the Americas. The Columbian Exchange also emphasizes how dependent we are on our environments and how changing ecosystems can deeply, rapidly, and unexpectedly change societies. Finally, the Columbian Exchange goes a long way in describing the world's diversity of cuisines and how they have relied on global exchanges as well as adoption and adaptation. Without such flexibility, much of what we eat today and even associate with particular cultures wouldn't exist. With that final thought, let's look at the Texas favorite, barbecue sauce, as a conglomeration of the forces unleashed by the Columbian Exchanges. Although each sauce is a product of a beloved and closely guarded recipe, the main ingredients are almost invariably tomatoes, indigenous to the Americas, brown sugar from an Asian plant that prospered in the tropics of the Americas and led to the enslavements of millions of Africans, some sort of pepper, whether paprika, cayenne, or jalapeno, they all derive from the plants indigenous to the Americas. Honeybees came to America along with European colonists, and vinegar derived from European grapes. Something to think about the next time you think about what belongs to a culture, or you just simply fire up a grill.